There are places where history does not disappear, it accumulates. One name is placed over another. One sanctuary rises where another once stood. One sacred image replaces an older one, yet something of the first remains underneath. Generations pass, stories become traditions become identities, and eventually the layers are so tightly fused that separating them feels almost impossible. Tepeyac is one of those places. Only a short time after the fall of Tenochtitlan, when the political, religious, and cultural universe of the Mexica people had been violently overturned, a hill outside the newly transformed Mexico City remained charged with sacred meaning. For generations, indigenous people had associated that place with Tonantzin, our revered mother, a maternal sacred figure deeply rooted in the Nahua religious world. And then, according to the story now known by millions, on that same hill appeared a brown-skinned virgin who spoke Nahuatl and asked that a temple be built there. The geographical continuity is impossible to ignore. The emotional continuity is even harder to ignore. But before going any further, we need to establish something clearly. This investigation is not going to tell you that the Virgin of Guadalupe is false. It is not going to tell you that your faith, if you have one, is foolish. And it is not going to claim that Baruch Spinoza personally exposed some secret about Mexico. Spinoza never wrote about Guadalupe. He never analyzed Juan Diego. He never wrote about Tonantzin or the conquest of Mexico. To pretend otherwise would be intellectually dishonest. What Spinoza did leave behind was something far more useful. A method for examining religious claims without granting them automatic immunity simply because they are sacred. A method for asking how texts were produced, when they appeared, who benefited from particular interpretations, how fear and hope influence human judgment, and whether what people call supernatural might instead have causes they do not yet understand. That distinction matters. We are not asking, what did Spinoza believe about Guadalupe? We are asking a more responsible question. What happens when the kind of critical method Spinoza defended is applied to the historical record surrounding Guadalupe? And once we ask that, the story becomes much more complicated than either the believer or the skeptic might expect. When the Spanish defeated Tenochtitlan in 1521, they conquered a political center. They did not instantly conquer an imagination. Armies can destroy temples. They cannot erase memory with the same efficiency. A population may outwardly accept new symbols while continuing to interpret them through older categories. A sacred place may receive a Christian name while retaining emotional associations formed long before Christianity arrived. A pilgrimage can survive even when the official identity of its destination changes. That possibility is not merely theoretical. The Franciscan chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún, who spent years documenting Nahua culture, recorded something deeply revealing. Indigenous people continued traveling to Tepeyac, and they referred to the Virgin there by the name Tonantzin. This disturbed him. Why? Because from his perspective, the new Catholic devotion risked becoming a continuation of the older indigenous cult under Christian clothing. That is extraordinarily important. The suspicion that Guadalupe and Tonantzin might overlap culturally is not merely a theory invented centuries later by modern skeptics. Anxiety about that possibility existed among colonial religious authorities themselves, and this immediately brings us to a question Spinoza would have considered legitimate whenever sacred history is involved. What explanation best fits the evidence we actually possess? A completely new supernatural event with no meaningful dependence on the earlier sacred geography? Or the gradual transformation of an existing religious landscape in which an ancient maternal symbol survived by acquiring another form? Notice what this question does not do. It does not automatically prove fraud. Human cultures rarely transform through simple fraud. They transform through memory, adaptation, conflict, translation, emotion, power, and necessity. A conquered people do not suddenly become empty containers waiting to be filled with the religion of their conquerors. They interpret, they combine, they preserve. Sometimes they hide. Sometimes they transform what they already know. And sometimes the conqueror eventually adapts as well. This is where the Guadalupe story begins to move beyond the simplistic choice between miracle and conspiracy. Because the historical evidence suggests something far more human, there were disagreements. There were competing interpretations. There were religious authorities who encouraged the devotion and others who feared it. There were indigenous communities who appear to have embraced the site through categories they already understood. And there were institutions gradually learning how to respond to a religious force that was growing regardless of whether every official approved of it. One scene from 1556 reveals this tension with remarkable clarity. On September 8 of that year, Franciscan friar Francisco de Bustamante stood before an audience that included powerful colonial authorities and openly attacked the devotion developing at Tepeyac. Just days earlier, Archbishop Alonso de Montúfar had spoken favorably about the miracles associated with the Virgin of Guadalupe. Bustamante took the opposite position. He warned that the devotion could encourage disguised idolatry among indigenous believers. Even more provocatively, he claimed that the image being venerated had been painted by an indigenous artist. The archbishop was sufficiently disturbed by the sermon that a formal investigation followed. Think carefully about what this means. If the Guadalupe devotion had been invented through a perfectly coordinated plan by the Church, as though the Church were one mind with one strategy, then this documented conflict becomes difficult to explain. Why would an influential Franciscan publicly condemn what another major church authority was actively promoting? Why would internal opposition become serious enough to trigger an investigation? The historical record looks less like a flawless conspiracy and more like something much more ordinary and perhaps much more revealing. Different institutions and individuals were responding differently to a popular devotion already taking shape. That difference matters because power rarely operates in the neat way conspiracy theories imagine. Power does not always design symbols from the beginning. Sometimes it inherits them. Sometimes it opposes them. Sometimes it discovers that opposing them is ineffective. And then it begins to manage them. That is where the Spinozist question becomes genuinely interesting. Political and religious authority does not need to invent every belief it eventually uses. It only needs to recognize which existing beliefs can be incorporated into a stable social order. A government does not have to create a river in order to build a canal. It simply has to learn how to redirect the water already flowing. And perhaps that is a better metaphor for what happened at Tepeyac. The devotion may not have begun as a single centrally designed project. It may instead have emerged from overlapping indigenous memory, Christian symbolism, colonial conflict, pastoral strategy, and popular religious need. The same hill remained. The pilgrimage remained. The maternal language remained. But the sacred image changed. And once that transformation began, neither side could completely control what it would become. That leads us into the next, more difficult question. Because cultural continuity is only one part of the problem. The other part is documentary. And once we examine what was and was not written near the alleged date of the apparition, the historical picture becomes far more uncomfortable. The year traditionally associated with the apparitions of Guadalupe is 1531. According to the familiar narrative, Juan Diego encountered the Virgin at Tepeyac. She spoke to him, instructed him to approach the bishop, provided miraculous signs, and eventually left her image on his tilma. For millions, this is not merely history. It is family memory. It is national identity. It is devotion. It is prayer. And precisely because the story carries such enormous emotional weight, examining its documentary history requires unusual discipline. The central issue is simple. Where are the contemporary records? A dramatic supernatural event supposedly occurred near one of the most important colonial cities in the Americas. It involved a bishop. It involved an indigenous convert. It involved a miraculous image. It eventually became one of the most important Marian devotions on earth. Yet the early documentary trail is remarkably difficult. The transcript we are examining emphasizes that no surviving contemporary document from 1531 clearly narrates the complete apparition story as it would later become known. No contemporary letter gives us the familiar sequence. No surviving ecclesiastical report from that exact moment records Juan Diego presenting miraculous roses and revealing the image before the bishop. No known eyewitness chronicle from 1531 provides the developed narrative that later generations would inherit. This does not logically prove that nothing happened. That distinction must be preserved. Absence of documentation is not the same thing as proof of non-existence. But absence of documentation changes the degree of historical certainty we are justified in claiming. This is exactly the sort of distinction Spinoza wanted readers to make. A critical reader does not begin with the conclusion he emotionally prefers and then force every silence to support it. He asks what the text can actually establish. If an event is recorded immediately by several independent observers, that gives us one type of historical evidence. If a detailed narrative appears much later, after decades of oral development and devotional interpretation, that gives us another type. Both can be meaningful, but they are not historically identical. The first major printed Spanish account, describing the Guadalupe apparition narrative, appeared with the priest, Miguel Sanchez, in 1648. That is more than a century after the traditional date of 1531. A year later, in 1649, Luis Lasso de la Vega published the famous Nahuatl account, commonly known through the opening words, Nican Mopohua. That text would become enormously important in shaping the devotional narrative. There has been serious scholarly debate over whether its core may be older than the date of publication. The indigenous intellectual Antonio Valeriano has often been associated with possible earlier authorship, but the distinction remains important. A hypothesis concerning earlier composition is not identical to possessing a securely dated contemporary manuscript from 1531. This is precisely where historical criticism becomes uncomfortable. People often imagine that skepticism means declaring, "It did not happen." That is not necessarily what skepticism requires. Sometimes skepticism simply means refusing to claim more certainty than the evidence allows. Perhaps some tradition circulated orally. Perhaps an earlier version existed and has been lost. Perhaps elements of the later narrative preserve memories much older than the surviving printed texts. All are possibilities, but possibility is not documentation. And when several decades, or, in the case of the major printed narrative, more than a century separate a reported event from the sources through which later generations encounter it, a question becomes unavoidable. How much of the story belongs to the original event, and how much belongs to the generations that retold it? Human memory is not a camera. Communal memory, even less so. Stories evolve because communities use them. A narrative is remembered not only because of what occurred, but because of what the story comes to mean. Details become sharper, symbols become richer, loose traditions acquire structure, ambiguities disappear. The hero becomes clearer, the antagonist becomes clearer, coincidence becomes destiny. A sacred story eventually finds the form that best expresses the identity of the community carrying it. This does not require conscious lying. That point is essential. People can sincerely transmit a story while gradually transforming it. In fact, sincerity can make the process stronger because every generation believes it is protecting something true. Imagine a story told in a family for 100 years. The great-grandparents experienced something. Their children tell it. Then grandchildren tell it. Then descendants who never met the original witnesses inherit the story. Certain details fade. Others grow. A sentence spoken uncertainly becomes a decisive declaration. A coincidence acquires symbolic meaning. Eventually, the family is no longer preserving only an event. It is preserving an identity. Now, multiply that process across a population. Combine it with religious ritual, social upheaval, cultural conquest, conversion, indigenous oral traditions, clerical interpretation, political pressure, and the need for a shared sacred symbol. That is the environment in which the Guadalupe tradition developed. And this is why the documentary silence matters. Not because silence disproves belief. It matters because silence gives tradition room to develop. Spinoza's method would insist that we distinguish the theological meaning of a story from the historical evidence supporting each of its details. Religious institutions often resist this distinction because the emotional power of a sacred narrative depends on presenting the story as a seamless whole. But history is almost never seamless. History contains gaps, contradiction, late sources, competing witnesses, political interests, memory, revision, interpretation. The more honest question is therefore not, can I destroy this story? It is, what can I actually know? That question is much more dangerous, because once you learn to ask it about one sacred tradition, you may begin asking it about others. And once that habit develops, authority loses one of its greatest protections, the assumption that certain claims are too sacred to investigate. Yet the silence surrounding 1531 is not the only difficulty. There is another object at the center of the entire devotion, an object seen by millions, an object treated by believers as physical evidence that something extraordinary occurred, the tilma. And when we turn from the narrative to the image itself, the historical dispute becomes even sharper. The image of Our Lady of Guadalupe is not merely an illustration attached to the story. For many believers, it is the story made visible. According to the traditional narrative, the image appeared miraculously on Juan Diego's cloak when he opened it before Bishop Zumarraga, and the roses he had gathered fell to the floor. No painter created it. No ordinary hand produced it. The image was presented as a sign, and this is exactly why the 1556 controversy matters so much. When Francisco de Bustamante publicly condemned the growing devotion at Tepeyac, he reportedly described the image as having been painted by an indigenous person. Later historical discussions associated this artist with Marcos Chipac de Aquino, an indigenous painter active in colonial Mexico and trained within the artistic environment shaped by the friars. Whether every later attribution can be established beyond dispute is another matter. But the existence of a 16th-century clerical accusation that the image had a human painter cannot simply be brushed aside. Again, the point is methodological. If the image had already been universally understood in 1556 as a supernatural object whose miraculous origin was established and known by the highest authorities, why was an important Franciscan able to publicly describe it as a painting? Why did such disagreement exist only a generation after the traditional date of the apparition? The answer may be complicated. Perhaps different groups possessed different versions of the story. Perhaps the miraculous interpretation was still developing. Perhaps some clergy rejected a tradition that others accepted. Perhaps a humanly produced devotional image later became integrated into a larger apparition narrative. Or perhaps Bustamante was simply wrong. Historical inquiry must leave open every possibility supported by evidence. But what it cannot honestly do is pretend that the conflict never existed. This is what happens when history collides with mature tradition. The mature tradition looks backward and imagines that people near the beginning already understood events exactly as later generations would understand them. But that is often false. Religions develop. Symbols acquire meanings gradually. Doctrines become formalized. Stories become standardized. A devotion that seems ancient and fixed from the perspective of the 21st century may have looked fluid, disputed, and uncertain to people living near its origins. That does not make the devotion meaningless. It makes it historical. And to Spinoza, anything existing within history must be examined through causes. Why did people believe? Why did a symbol spread? What emotional needs did it answer? What political conditions helped shape its survival? Which institutions resisted it? Which institutions later adopted it? What earlier symbols made it recognizable? When those questions are asked, the image of Guadalupe begins to appear within a larger network of causes rather than as an isolated object floating outside history. Consider the indigenous population of 16th-century central Mexico. Their political world had been shattered. Sacred institutions had been destroyed or reinterpreted. Old gods were condemned. Old rituals were suppressed. A new theological vocabulary was imposed. Yet people still needed sacred geography. They still needed maternal symbolism. They still needed protection. They still needed meaning. They still grieved. They still feared. They still hoped. Human beings do not stop needing symbolic structures merely because one empire defeats another. In fact, during periods of extreme disruption, symbols can become even more necessary. A maternal sacred figure at an already sacred hill would have possessed enormous emotional power. To indigenous converts, such a figure could potentially bridge two worlds. To Christian missionaries, the same figure could become a vehicle of conversion. To colonial authorities, a shared religious image could contribute to social cohesion. To ordinary families, none of those political calculations might matter. They could simply love her. This is the complexity that simple theories miss. A symbol can serve power without being created exclusively by power. A devotion can emerge within conquest and later become a source of dignity for the descendants of the conquered. A religious image can be used politically and still inspire genuine private faith. A historically constructed tradition can produce authentic emotional experiences. These statements do not contradict one another. They only seem contradictory when we insist that something must be either completely divine or completely fraudulent, completely oppressive or completely liberating. History is rarely so obedient to our categories. This is where Spinoza becomes especially useful. His philosophy encourages us to stop asking whether an event deserves our approval and instead ask what causes produced it. Understanding does not mean excusing. It does not mean attacking. It means refusing to remain satisfied with appearances. And the image itself forces this discipline upon us. The transcript notes that conservation examinations over time have identified alterations and later additions to elements of the image. Access to completely independent technical analysis has been limited, so sweeping scientific declarations should be treated cautiously. That caution must operate in both directions. A skeptic should not claim that every scientific question has been conclusively settled if it has not. A believer should not claim that science has conclusively established miraculous origin if it has not. The disciplined position is simpler. There are historical reasons to ask whether the image was produced and modified through ordinary artistic processes. There is also continuing dispute over what can be established about its material history. Therefore, the question remains legitimate. That may sound modest, but intellectual modesty can be more disruptive than certainty, because a sacred object does not need to be disproved for its historical status to change. It only needs to be brought back inside nature. And this is precisely where we finally arrive at Spinoza's most radical argument. The deepest issue is not whether someone painted the tilma. The deepest issue is what we mean when we call anything a miracle. For Spinoza, the usual concept of a miracle contained a philosophical problem. People normally imagine a miracle as an event in which God temporarily interrupts the laws of nature. Nature ordinarily works one way. Then God intervenes. The rules are suspended. Something impossible under normal conditions occurs, and afterward, nature resumes its ordinary course. But Spinoza rejected the assumption beneath this entire picture. For him, God and nature could not be understood as two completely separate realities, one standing outside the other like a king issuing orders to a machine. Within his philosophical framework, reality forms one infinite order. Nature is not a system created and occasionally interrupted by an external divine personality. Everything that exists follows from the same ultimate reality. Therefore, a violation of nature would not reveal God. It would imply that reality had contradicted its own nature. That, for Spinoza, was incoherent. What people call miracles are not violations of natural law. They are events whose causes they do not understand. This distinction changes almost everything. Imagine an eclipse before astronomy. The sky darkens in the middle of the day. Animals become restless. The temperature falls. People who do not understand celestial motion may interpret the event as divine anger, a warning, a supernatural battle, or the death of the sun. The experience is real. The darkness is real. The fear is real. What changes is the explanation. Once the cause becomes understood, the eclipse does not become less astonishing. It simply stops functioning as evidence that nature has been suspended. Spinoza believed that ignorance frequently turns surprise into superstition. We experience an event. We do not know its cause. Our imagination dislikes uncertainty, so it creates an intention. Someone must have wanted this. A divine being sent it. A demon caused it. The universe is punishing us. The universe is rewarding us. What we cannot explain becomes personalized. And once nature is imagined as a theater of invisible intentions, fear becomes extraordinarily powerful. Now return to Tepeyac. The Guadalupe tradition includes extraordinary signs, including flowers said to have appeared under unusual seasonal conditions. From a Spinozist perspective, the first question would not be, how can we defend the miracle? Nor would it be, how can we mock the believer? The question would be, what natural causes must be excluded before a supernatural explanation is even considered? Could flowers grow under particular local conditions? Could they have been cultivated? Could later storytelling have intensified the unusual character of the event? Do we possess contemporary evidence sufficient to reconstruct what occurred? These questions may feel less emotionally satisfying than the word miracle, but they are more disciplined. Spinoza's point goes deeper than any particular flower, image, or apparition. He wants us to notice our own mental habit. When something supports our hopes, we call it providence. When something threatens us, we call it punishment. When coincidence seems meaningful, we assume design. When we survive danger, we imagine we were specially protected. When another person does not survive, we struggle to explain why the same protection did not apply. The mind constantly moves from event to intention. Why? Because intention feels easier to understand than causality. A storm has thousands of physical causes, but God was angry requires only one emotional image. A disease has biological mechanisms, but someone cursed me gives the fear a face. Political collapse emerges from economics, institutions, geography, psychology, historical pressure, and countless interacting decisions. But evil people caused everything gives us a simple enemy. Spinoza considered this simplification dangerous because it leaves human beings vulnerable to those who claim authority over invisible causes. If someone convinces you that disaster is caused by divine displeasure, that person may also claim to know how to restore divine favor. If someone convinces you that your eternal destiny depends upon obedience to an institution, that institution acquires extraordinary leverage over your behavior. If someone defines which events are miracles, which are punishments, which are signs, and which are heresies, that person is not merely interpreting reality, he is organizing your imagination. And whoever organizes imagination can often govern behavior without visible force. This brings us from theology to politics. Spinoza understood that fear is one of the most effective instruments of social control, precisely because frightened people often participate willingly in their own obedience. The person controlled by physical chains knows he is controlled. The person controlled by sacred fear may call the same condition devotion. That does not mean every religious person is manipulated. It means religious imagination can become politically useful. There is a crucial difference. Many believers experience faith as strength, solidarity, consolation, resistance, generosity, or moral courage. Those experiences cannot be reduced to control, but institutions can still recognize the governing potential of beliefs people already possess. Again, power does not need to invent every river. It needs to learn where the river is flowing. And the Guadalupe devotion eventually became a river of extraordinary power. Its image entered homes, processions, churches, political movements, national identity, family rituals, personal grief, public resistance. That scale cannot be explained simply by saying the church invented it. Such an explanation is too crude. But neither can we ignore how an institution might benefit from directing such devotion. The more subtle Spinozist question is, when a spontaneous or semi-spontaneous religious symbol becomes socially powerful, what happens when authority learns to speak through it? That question leads directly into the relationship between superstition and political stability, one of the most disturbing themes in Spinoza's political thought. Spinoza lived in a world where religion and political authority were deeply entangled. To question religious interpretation was never merely an abstract intellectual exercise. Ideas could threaten institutions. The interpretation of Scripture could affect law. Theological disagreement could become political disorder. And fear could be mobilized by rulers and clergy alike. Spinoza understood something that remains relevant far beyond his own century. People are easiest to manipulate when they are uncertain. Fear and hope are unstable emotions. Both depend on a future we cannot control. Fear imagines an evil that may arrive. Hope imagines a good that may arrive. Because neither outcome is certain, the mind swings between them. And whoever claims to interpret that uncertain future can acquire power. This is one reason superstition thrives in periods of instability. War, disease, conquest, political crisis, economic collapse, cultural displacement. These conditions intensify the human desire for signs. People want to know that events have meaning. They want to believe someone understands what is happening. They want reassurance that suffering belongs to a larger pattern. Now consider 16th century Mexico. It would be difficult to imagine a society experiencing greater disruption. Political sovereignty had collapsed. Cities had been transformed. Disease devastated populations. Religious systems were attacked. Sacred images were destroyed. Old social hierarchies were reorganized. New rulers imposed new institutions. Languages and symbols collided. Under these conditions, the appearance of a powerful maternal religious symbol at an already sacred location cannot be treated as culturally insignificant. Whether one believes in an apparition or not, the symbol answered real human needs: continuity, protection, motherhood, sacred belonging, a bridge between worlds. And this may help explain why the devotion became stronger than the objections of individual clergy. Bustamante could denounce it. Others could worry about indigenous idolatry. But if people continued to make pilgrimages, pray, and attach meaning to the image, authority faced a choice: suppress the devotion and risk driving it outside institutional control, or incorporate it. History offers many examples of religions absorbing older customs rather than eliminating them entirely. Sacred calendars overlap. Festivals are renamed. Local holy places receive new saints. Older symbols acquire new theological interpretations. The process is usually not the result of one secret meeting. Cultures adapt through countless local decisions made over generations. A priest tolerates a custom, another reinterprets it. A bishop recognizes its popularity. Families continue practicing it. Artists provide new imagery. Stories develop. Eventually, what once looked suspicious becomes tradition. This is far more plausible than imagining a single mastermind controlling everything. It is also more consistent with how institutions actually behave. Institutions evolve. They compete internally. They absorb practices that once made them uncomfortable. And after enough time, the compromise becomes so old that people forget there ever was a conflict. Tepeyac appears to fit this broader pattern of religious layering. The sacred geography did not disappear. The maternal dimension did not disappear. Indigenous participation did not disappear. Instead, these elements gradually became incorporated into a Catholic framework. And here an uncomfortable thought emerges. Perhaps the real power of Guadalupe came not from completely erasing Tonantzin, but from making it possible for cultural memory to survive inside a new symbol. If so, then the devotion cannot be understood only as an instrument imposed from above. It also becomes an adaptation from below. This changes the moral picture. A conquered people are not merely passive recipients of symbols. They reinterpret the conqueror. They take what is imposed and alter its meaning. They build new identities from fragments of destroyed worlds. They can transform an instrument of domination into an emblem of belonging. This is one reason Guadalupe later became attached not only to ecclesiastical authority, but also to popular movements and Mexican identity. Symbols escape their creators, if anyone creates them at all. Once a symbol enters collective imagination, no institution possesses complete control over its future. A mother painted for conversion can become the mother of a nation. A religious banner can become a political banner. An image associated with colonial evangelization can later accompany resistance to political authority. This transformation matters because simplistic skepticism often makes the same mistake as simplistic belief. The believer may say, "The story is sacred, therefore every historical detail must be literally true." The skeptic may answer, "Some historical details are uncertain, therefore the entire symbol is meaningless." Both positions move too quickly. Historical construction does not equal emotional falsity. A national flag is physically manufactured by human beings. That does not make the grief of a soldier's family fake. A wedding ring is produced in a workshop. That does not make the commitment it represents unreal. Language itself is culturally constructed, yet the pain caused by an insult and the comfort created by a loving sentence are completely real. Meaning does not require supernatural manufacture. This becomes one of the most powerful consequences of applying Spinoza's method carefully. We do not have to destroy human meaning in order to reject superstition. We can ask how something arose without denying what it later became. We can distinguish origins from significance. We can separate historical probability from personal devotion. We can even understand why a person might continue visiting the Basilica of Guadalupe after learning that the early history is much more complicated than the devotional narrative suggests. Because perhaps the person's relationship is no longer primarily with 1531. Perhaps it is with a grandmother who prayed there, a mother who carried the image, a family promise, a childhood memory, a sense of Mexican identity, a moment of grief, a feeling of being accompanied when no one else was present. Historical criticism cannot erase those experiences, but neither should those experiences be used to silence historical criticism. Both can exist. And recognizing this distinction brings us toward another aspect of Spinoza that is often badly misunderstood. He did not simply want to destroy spiritual experience. His real target was something else: dependence on explanations that enslave the mind. It is easy to caricature Spinoza as a philosopher who wanted to remove everything sacred from human life. That picture is incomplete. Spinoza's rejection of traditional miracles did not mean he regarded existence as empty. Quite the opposite. His philosophy presents reality itself as something of immense depth. The problem, for him, was not wonder. The problem was ignorance disguised as explanation. There is a profound difference between looking at nature with awe and claiming that nature has violated itself for your benefit. There is a difference between having an intense spiritual experience and building a historical claim that everyone else must accept. There is a difference between feeling unity with existence and concluding that an institution has exclusive authority to interpret that experience. Spinoza's philosophy makes room for forms of understanding that go beyond ordinary fragmented perception. He describes higher forms of knowledge in which the individual grasps things as part of a larger order rather than as isolated events. From such a perspective, human beings stop imagining themselves as exceptions, standing outside nature. We become part of the same reality we are trying to understand. That idea transforms the Guadalupe question. Suppose someone climbed Tepeyac in the 16th century and experienced something overwhelming, a sense of presence, a profound maternal image, an intuition of sacred unity, a moment in which fear disappeared and existence seemed meaningful. Does historical skepticism require us to declare that experience fake? No. The experience could have been psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually real. But that is a different claim from saying that a physically identifiable, supernatural person objectively appeared at a specific time, performed specific actions, produced specific flowers, and miraculously printed an image on a garment. These claims operate at different levels. One concerns lived experience. The other concerns public historical events. And once we distinguish them, the discussion becomes far more mature. Human beings constantly confuse interpretation with experience. Someone dreams of a deceased parent and wakes in tears. The experience is real. The emotion is real. The dream occurred. But whether the deceased parent literally visited from another realm is an additional interpretation. Someone prays during a crisis and suddenly feels peace. The peace is real. The psychological transformation is real. But whether an external supernatural being directly caused that exact moment is another question. Someone stands before the Guadalupe image and experiences deep consolation. No historian can disprove that consolation. No chemical analysis of the tilma can erase it, but the consolation itself does not establish how the image was originally produced. This distinction protects both reason and human experience. We do not need to humiliate people in order to think critically, and we do not need to abandon critical thinking in order to respect what human symbols mean. Spinoza's deeper enemy was bondage. A person is in bondage when emotions and ideas act through him without being understood. Fear commands him. Hope drags him. Anger possesses him. Authority tells him what to think. He believes he is choosing freely, but much of his behavior follows causes he has never examined. Freedom, therefore, does not mean becoming a supernatural exception to causality. It means understanding more of the causes that move us. Apply that idea personally. Why does a particular image move you? Why does criticism of a religious symbol make you angry? Why does a skeptical argument make someone else feel triumphant? Are either of those reactions purely rational? Or are identity, family, fear, pride, memory, and belonging operating underneath them? Suppose you hear that Guadalupe may contain continuities with Tonantzin. If you are Catholic, perhaps your first impulse is defense. If you are hostile to Catholicism, perhaps your first impulse is celebration. But both reactions can become obstacles, because both begin with the emotional need for the evidence to confirm an identity. Spinoza asks for something harder. Understand first. React later. What did the early sources say? What did they not say? Which religious authorities disagreed? When did specific narratives appear? What cultural practices survived? What can material analysis establish? Which claims remain uncertain? What does historical continuity actually mean? Only after those questions are examined should we decide what conclusions are justified. That habit of mind is not limited to religion. It changes politics, relationships, news, identity, fear. Whenever we encounter information that threatens what we already believe, we tend to stop analyzing and start defending. The mind becomes a lawyer rather than an investigator. It searches for evidence that protects its position. Spinoza would say that this is not freedom. It is passion acting through us. Understanding begins when we become capable of observing our own reaction as another event with causes. Why do I need this to be true? Why do I need it to be false? What part of my identity feels threatened? What evidence would actually change my mind? Those questions are difficult because they remove the comfort of certainty, but they also open a deeper form of freedom. You can honor your mother without believing every family legend literally. You can love your country while acknowledging its crimes. You can value a religious symbol while examining its history. You can reject supernatural claims without mocking those who find genuine comfort in them. Understanding gives us this flexibility. And once that becomes possible, the Guadalupe question stops being merely a battle between believer and atheist. It becomes a mirror. What are you actually defending when you defend a sacred story? Truth? Identity? Memory? Fear? Belonging? And are you willing to know the difference? There is another reason this story cannot be reduced to a debate about miracles. Guadalupe has become something much larger than the question of what happened at Tepeyac in 1531. For millions of people, especially in Mexico and throughout the Mexican diaspora, Guadalupe exists inside national and family memory. Her image appears on walls, altars, clothing, murals, candles, political banners, neighborhood shrines, cars, tattoos, funerals, birthdays, bedrooms, markets, prison, hospitals. She belongs to spaces far beyond official theology. That cultural life matters. A symbol can emerge within a particular historical power structure and later acquire meanings that the original authorities could never fully control. This is one of history's great ironies. A symbol associated with evangelization after conquest can become an emblem of the people who survived that conquest. An image promoted by religious authority can later appear in popular resistance. A devotion once suspected by some friars of hiding indigenous religion can eventually become one of the most recognizable expressions of Mexican Catholic identity. That transformation alone should warn us against simplistic explanations. Was Guadalupe created to control indigenous people? That sentence is too simple. Were there political advantages in channeling indigenous devotion into Catholic structures? Certainly, that is a serious historical question. Did religious institutions sometimes benefit from absorbing pre-existing sacred practices? Yes, the broader pattern makes the question legitimate. But did ordinary people also reinterpret the symbol for themselves? Clearly. Did generations of families attach meanings to Guadalupe that cannot be reduced to colonial strategy? Yes. Did the image become something culturally larger than whatever occurred during its early formation? Without question. This is why historical criticism should not behave like iconoclasm. The goal is not to walk into someone's home, tear down an image of their grandmother's virgin, and announce that reason has won. That would not be philosophy. It would be another form of emotional domination. Understanding should make us less arrogant, not more. The deeper insight is that human symbols have histories, and those histories can contain conquest and consolation at the same time. They can contain manipulation and sincere devotion. They can contain institutional strategy and popular creativity. They can contain indigenous continuity beneath Christian vocabulary. They can contain genuine love, even when the historical narrative surrounding them is uncertain. If we accept that complexity, we become capable of asking a better question. Not, is Guadalupe fake? But, what exactly are we talking about when we say Guadalupe? Are we talking about a historical apparition? A painted image? A 17th century narrative? A 16th century pilgrimage site? A transformation of Tonantzin? A Catholic devotion? A colonial instrument? A symbol of mestizo identity? A maternal figure? A political emblem? A family inheritance? These are not the same thing. And an answer about one does not automatically settle the others. Perhaps the apparition narrative lacks the contemporary documentary confirmation many assume exists. That does not erase the later historical power of the symbol. Perhaps indigenous religious memory contributed substantially to the devotion's formation. That does not mean every later believer is secretly worshiping an Aztec goddess. Perhaps ecclesiastical authority found the devotion useful. That does not mean every priest or believer participated in deliberate manipulation. Perhaps the image was painted by human hands. That does not make every prayer said before it psychologically meaningless. This is what intellectual maturity looks like, the ability to keep distinctions alive. Superstition often collapses distinctions. It turns uncertainty into certainty, tradition into eyewitness history, emotion into proof, authority into truth. Spinoza's method reverses that process. Separate. Examine. Compare. Understand causes. Resist the temptation to declare more than the evidence can support. The historical record described in the source before us leaves several important points worthy of critical consideration. Tepeyac had pre-Christian sacred associations connected to Tonantzin. Colonial religious authorities themselves noticed and worried about the continuity. A documented ecclesiastical conflict emerged in 1556 over the growing devotion. The fully developed printed apparition accounts arrived much later than the traditional date of 1531. A 16th century Franciscan publicly described the image as the work of an indigenous painter. None of these facts individually solves the entire Guadalupe question. Together, however, they make one conclusion unavoidable. The historical formation of the devotion is far more complex than the simplified version many people receive as children. And perhaps that is not a tragedy. Perhaps complexity does not destroy meaning. Perhaps it frees meaning from the need to depend on historical simplification. A tradition that can survive investigation is stronger than one that requires silence. A faith that collapses when confronted with history was already resting on fragile foundations, and an identity that requires us to suppress inconvenient evidence becomes a prison. Spinoza paid a heavy personal price for insisting on freedom of thought. His willingness to examine sacred texts through history, language, politics, and human motives placed him in conflict with religious authority. But the principle he defended reaches far beyond his own disputes. No book becomes immune to investigation merely because people call it holy. No institution becomes infallible because it invokes God. No tradition becomes historically certain because millions cherish it. And no skeptic becomes automatically correct merely because he rejects religion. Everyone must submit to the same demand: evidence, coherence, causality, intellectual honesty. This brings us to the final confrontation. Because after examining Tonantzin, Tepeyac, Bustamante, the documentary silence, the tilma, miracles, and political power, the most important subject is no longer Guadalupe, it is you. What happens when evidence threatens something you love? That may be the most important question in this entire discussion. Not whether you are Catholic, not whether you believe Juan Diego saw the Virgin, not whether you think the Guadalupe image was miraculous, but what your mind does when an inherited belief encounters uncertainty. Do you investigate? Or do you defend? Do you become curious? Or offended? Do you ask what the evidence allows you to conclude? Or do you search immediately for whatever protects the conclusion you already possess? These questions extend far beyond religion. Most of us live inside stories we did not create. Stories about our family, our nation, our politics, our morality, our enemies, our success, our suffering, our identity. We inherit them before we are old enough to examine them. By the time we can reason critically, the stories already feel like part of ourselves. That is why questioning a belief can feel like questioning a person. But a belief is not your body. A tradition is not your mind. A symbol is not the entirety of your identity. You can examine something without betraying it. Sometimes examining a tradition reveals that its history is richer than its official version. Sometimes it reveals contradictions. Sometimes manipulation. Sometimes beauty. Usually, it reveals all of them mixed together. That may be the deepest lesson of Tepeyac. Before Guadalupe, the hill already carried sacred memory. After conquest, that memory did not simply disappear. A new religious world settled over an older one. For some clergy, the overlap looked dangerous. For others, it became useful. For indigenous communities, the new symbol could be interpreted through older emotional and cultural categories. Over generations, the devotion developed, acquired stories, absorbed theological meaning, entered national life, and eventually became inseparable from the identity of millions. Was that process planned from the beginning? The evidence described in the source does not support such a simple conclusion. Was it entirely disconnected from political power? That would also be difficult to maintain. Was it simply Tonantzin wearing a Catholic mask? Again, too simple. Was it simply a fully formed Marian devotion, appearing without cultural continuity from the world around it? The historical context makes that difficult to defend without qualification. The truth is more complex, and complexity is exactly what superstition resists. Superstition wants certainty without investigation. Spinoza wanted understanding. Understanding does not always give us emotionally satisfying answers. Sometimes it gives us probabilities, distinctions, incomplete records, competing interpretations, unanswered questions. But those are not failures. They are signs that we have stopped demanding that reality behave like a simple story. Human freedom begins there. Not when we magically escape every cause that has shaped us, but when we begin to understand those causes. Consider your own beliefs. How many came from direct examination? How many came from your parents, your church, your school, your political environment, your country, your fears, your desire to belong? How many beliefs would you have if you had been born 5,000 miles away? How many convictions feel self-evident only because everyone around you repeated them before you learned to question them? Spinoza's challenge is not to become cynical. Cynicism can be another form of intellectual laziness. The cynical person rejects before examining just as easily as the fanatic accepts before examining. Both allow emotion to make the decision first. The harder position is openness, disciplined by reason. Perhaps something happened at Tepeyac. Perhaps the later narrative preserves fragments of an earlier experience. Perhaps indigenous sacred memory and Catholic imagery gradually fused. Perhaps a painted image became the center of a tradition whose later meaning greatly exceeded the circumstances of its creation. Perhaps several of these processes occurred simultaneously. History often develops that way. What we should resist is the demand that uncertainty must immediately disappear. You do not need to solve every mystery in order to think clearly. Sometimes, freedom consists in saying, "I do not know exactly what happened, but I know which claims the surviving evidence supports more strongly than others." That sentence may lack the emotional force of miracle or conspiracy, but it contains something rarer: intellectual integrity. And perhaps this is where Spinoza's philosophy remains most dangerous. He does not ask us to replace one unquestioned authority with another. He does not ask us to believe him because he was a great philosopher. He asks us to understand, to examine causes, to read critically, to separate fear from evidence, to recognize how imagination can be governed, to see that a person who understands why he believes something is freer than a person who merely repeats what he inherited. So if Guadalupe is important to you, perhaps the question is not whether you must abandon her. Maybe the question is whether your relationship to the symbol can survive a fuller history. Can you enter the basilica knowing that Tepeyac had another sacred life before the Spanish arrived? Can you look at the image knowing that 16th century clergy themselves disputed its origin and meaning? Can you acknowledge the documentary gaps without feeling that every emotional connection must therefore disappear? Can you distinguish devotion from historical certainty? If you can, then perhaps knowledge has not destroyed the symbol. It has changed your relationship to it. You are no longer required to believe because ignorance protects you. You can choose what the tradition means to you with greater awareness of how it developed. And if you reject the devotion entirely, the same discipline applies. Do not reduce millions of people to fools. Do not confuse historical criticism with contempt. Do not assume that revealing human causes makes human meaning disappear. A symbol can be constructed and still become powerful. A tradition can change and still carry memory. An image can have a human history and still participate in deeply human experiences of grief, love, hope, identity, and belonging. Understanding should free us from both credulity and cruelty. That is the balance worth defending. The real question, then, is not simply whether the Virgin of Guadalupe was Tonantzin. The more serious question is how sacred identities are created when civilizations collide. How much survives beneath new names? How does power adapt what it cannot erase? How do communities transform symbols imposed upon them? How does memory become history? How does history become devotion? And at what point does a story become so deeply woven into a people's identity that questioning its origin feels like questioning the people themselves? Those questions cannot be answered by insult. They cannot be answered by blind faith either. They require evidence, patience, historical memory, and the courage to remain intellectually free even when the answer becomes uncomfortable. So before you leave, consider one final question. If tomorrow you discovered that one of the beliefs most important to your identity had a history far more complicated than you were taught, would you want to know, or would you prefer the simpler story? Write your answer in the comments, and tell us what you were taught about the origins of the Virgin of Guadalupe and Tonantzin. If this kind of philosophical and historical investigation interests you, subscribe and continue exploring with us. Because the purpose of philosophy is not to tell you what you must believe. It is to make it harder for anyone religious, political, or otherwise to decide what you believe without your understanding why. And that may be the kind of freedom Spinoza considered worth the price.